So Never Be Done, the Richard Lett story, is is an interesting film in that I'd never heard of Richard Lett before. He was apparently one of those provocateur comedians from many years ago. Basically, just got up on the stage and said like the most offensive things that he could. He made fun of people of color, people of different sexualities, and was basically one of those like rude comics. And yeah, it essentially showed like this film essentially highlights how over the course of 7 years he went from someone who was like a big comedic legend. He would hit the microphone many times. He would perform at so many clubs around Canada. And he also kind of had like a little bit of an acting career. Like he appeared on like Supernatural. So it seemed like he was on the rise. But then just like his comedy just sort of didn't resonate really well, and he sort of became, it seemed like everything was working out for him. He had like the comedy going, he had an acting role, he had a relationship where he had a daughter, and he really loved his daughter and still loves his daughter, but it just seems like his comedy didn't resonate, and he ended up getting kicked out of clubs, and like a lot of his humor just wasn't hitting, and people just really didn't dig him anymore. And because his comedy wasn't hitting, it seems like Lett just sort of got bitter about it, just got angry. Like we go into his apartment, we see that he's kind of like just scrawled stuff on the walls. We see that he's very angry and bitter. Like we found out that he doesn't really have much of any opportunities for stuff he can do besides comedy. And basically we just sort of like watch, for at least the first act, we kind of watch his life basically self-destruct, where basically like, he pushes people away. He's very angry about it. Like, he's struggling with addiction. It feels like his life is just crumbling around him and there's nothing he can do. Like he's getting kicked out of his apartment. He's struggling to just clean it up so he can get the damage claim, which he doesn't get. He gets very bitter and angry when he's just like he's basically just run out of his apartment, and he's like cursing, black people by saying the N-word, while he's just, basically going to live a life of being homeless. Like he ends up at like a homeless shelter, and it's just so disoriented and dismayed that, this is the life that he has. Like he went from being a comic who had lots of different like CDs and played at so many different clubs and had an acting career, to living out of a homeless shelter and just feeling like he didn't really have anything left. And it's like, it's kind of hard to like sympathize with him, because it seems like he does like push away a lot of people. And he just like favors, like the bitterness and the anger. But then there's kind of a little bit of like a happy ending here. Like basically he comes to terms with himself. He learns to be a better person. He finds a new act. He finds better jokes that he can tell, and basically tries to reform himself. And he more or less kind of does by the end. By the end of the film, you really do feel like he's kind of like progressed and made more with his life. I love how this documentary is shot. Like it's very much in Lett's face, and lets us know that someone is in his face. There are many times within this documentary where he basically calls out the camera people and the documentarians who are really committed to this. I mean, they filmed, like, this takes place over the course of like 7 years. We watch him, at like the late 2000s, like, when his life is sort of self-destructing, and then watching him reform when it gets more into the 2010s. And it's somewhat like sobering to watch this person who went from just being just angry and bitter and frustrated with the world and thought he could just insult his way into greatness, and it didn't happen, and then realizing that I have to reform my ways. And it's kind of interesting watching him. Like, we don't follow the full journey from him being in like the homeless shelter and trying to connect with other people and reform his act. We don't stick with him the whole time. We see a little bit of that, and then we catch up with him years later and kind of just see the transformation. I kind of would have liked if the documentarian stuck with him a little bit more, but it's on another level, it's kind of interesting to see just them catch up with him later and just see, the immediate transformation that he goes through. I will say this, I did like hearing a lot more, like his provocateur comedy is just, it just feels like, one of those provocateurs who doesn't really have anything clever to say and just says, like, the offensive stuff. Like, you've probably heard, like, his comedic bits slung by other comedians someplace at some time. But I gotta admit, some of his newer comedy that he shows off at the end of the film is actually pretty profound. Like, I really dug how I think he basically had a bit where he tried to put like a Shakespearean poetry bent on the idea of apps and Tinder. And it's actually kind of clever. I actually kind of dig the way that it's written and the way that he delivers it, and the audience seems to dig it as well. So it's an interesting journey to watch this comedian go through, to see how basically the insult and provocateur nature can only get you so far, especially when you're just meant to if you basically set out to just to offend everyone, and when everyone is offended and they don't want you in your clubs, then basically you just gotta find a new act at that point. And it's interesting how Lett doesn't immediately jump to that. It's mostly like after he's been shut out of all the clubs, it seems like he's trying to reform his life and just being angry at just at just the world in general. That it seems he's angry at the world. He's angry with himself. There's just a lot of things you can tell that he's working through to eventually get to that point by the end of the film. That actually kind of dug it. It's an interesting journey, especially since when we catch up with Lett a lot later, we see moments where he revisits parts of his past that were not his best moments, and basically coming to terms with that. And it seems like he's a lot happier from that point. So a very, very interesting journey. I really dug how the documentarians got very much involved with it. It doesn't just feel like a just let the camera roll and don't speak over it. It feels like there's actually like a conversation going, because it feels like when you're around Lett, like you can't not have a conversation. There are many interviews where people mention how much of a troublemaker he was, but how much someone who was interesting to be around. So even when he was being insulting and you really didn't dig his jokes, he was always someone who seemed very vocal and had something to say, even when it felt like he was in his darker moments. It felt like he was trying to connect with people and trying to find something in his life, something humorous, something insightful, anything. And you could definitely tell just based on the way that that he writes that poetry at the end, and like the comedy that he seeks, that he is a pretty damn good comic. He just basically just a matter of just cleaning your house, both mentally and literally in this type of documentary. So yeah, it's actually a bit of a surprise, considering I didn't know much about this comedian, and it was very fascinating to learn this about him. So for Never Be Done, the Richard Lett Story, 4 out of 5 stars.